while the language of Christian servanthood shifts. It becomes a language of humanitarian reform, of an effort
upon which so-called Negro slavery was constructed, based upon which Negro slavery was constructed on the Caribbean and Central America Aboriginals. There was a whole system already developed. It is in this sense that Eric Williams wrote in his History of Slavery in British America that white servitude was the historic base upon which Negro slavery was constructed. White servitude was the historic base upon which so-called Negro slavery was constructed, was built. They switched it up on you. You get it? They flipped it. It was on them, then they flipped it on you, and they called you Negro. Constructed. Estimates based on probate inventory suggest that as late as the second half of the 1670s, servants made up 80% of all Maryland's bound labor and thus outnumbered slaves in the colony by a ratio of 4 to 1. All right?
Indeed, not a single English or American sailor or traveler captured at sea by North African pirates between 1600 and 1775 described himself or herself as a white slave or even as white in over 36 published numbers. Instead, they described themselves as Christian captives, as Christian slaves, and frequently as English slaves. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam, a so-called renegade. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. A migrant whose whiteness marked his or her fungibility, their capacity to be bought and sold, rather than their rights as a political subject.
You hear that?
A white racial grammar emerged conspicuously in the 1680s in reference to one group, indentured servants. They're the only people described as white. Especially those transported to the New World as felons. The traffic and transport economics grew sharply in the 1680s, the same decade that witnessed a dramatic expansion and the importation of African slaves to North American plantations following Lincoln's Rebellion. In contrast to Christian servants, the term formerly used to describe all imported indentures, white servants read all the correspondence. Here, I'll give you an example. The deputy governor of Barbados characteristically described it in 1685 thusly: "We have been obliged to discharge our hired servants, who are a great safety to the island, since they formed most part of the militia, and they also curbed our Negroes and white servants, being the sweepings of jails." The striking distinction drawn here is not between Negroes and white servants, but between unfree laborers who are raced and servants and others who are unraced. Initially, then, the grammar of white skin and whiteness did not articulate privileges, but status as a trafficked, potentially dangerous subject for colonial authorities.
Hear that?
One of the most persistent and terrifying rumors for Barbadian leaders during the late 17th century was an alliance between indentured servants and African slaves, and many of those indentures, I should say, are Irishmen, a threat typically expressed with racial rather than religious signifiers. The language used to describe servant resistance, whether running away, teaming up with African slaves, or speaking decently to a master, in fact shifted with the emergence of white racial grammar. In the 1670s, before indentured servants were described as white, they were all Christian servants. 8 of 9 descriptions of servant resistance describe them as Christian servants. In the 1680s, by contrast, every description of servant resistance in the colonial state papers mentioned white servants, while none mentioned Christian servants. So what happens is when white grammar emerges, 2 things happen. It's used to describe the most troubled servants, the malefactors, the convicts. It's used to describe their commodification. It's used to describe their rebelliousness. While the language of Christian servanthood shifts. It becomes a language of humanitarian reform, of an effort to kind of ameliorate the conditions of indentured servants. Christian servants had rights, white servants were fungible. So this is not what I expect. Not at all. Christian servants had rights, white servants were fungible. So this is not what I expect. Not at all what I expected. The argument being that white racial grammar was not born white supremacists. It became that way. So then the question becomes how and why. What led to that evolution and the creation of an ideology of white victimhood and white power?
So we continue in the book White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia, a study of the system of indentured labor in the American colonies by James Curtis Bala. 1895, I believe it was written. And we're still in chapter 2. This is page 38. And it says here, another important source of involuntary servitude was found in the practice of spiriting. And I remember they actually changed the word kidnapping and called it spiriting. They were kidnapping people. That's what this meant, which grew up in the reign of Charles I and continued throughout the Commonwealth period in the reign of Charles II. It was an organized system of kidnapping persons, young and old, usually of the laboring classes, and transporting them to the plantations to be sold for the benefit of the kidnapper or shipmaster to whom they were assigned. They were kidnapping people from England in the streets, children, old people, anybody. They were kidnapping them, taking them by force, putting them on ships, right? What does this sound like? They told us they were grabbing Africans by force and bringing them over here, but they were actually grabbing undesirable felons, convicts, vagrants, beggars from England and dumping them by force in the plantations of America, all right? It became widely extended in England, but Bristol and London were the centers of the traffic. Throughout London and the parishes of Middlesex County, its agents called spirits were distributed, men, women, yeomen, tradesmen, doctors, and a class of rogues and idlers who earned a livelihood by this means. Even doctors, anybody got into women. It was good business, kidnapping people. The ladies of the court, and even the maids, the suspicion of profiting by this lucrative business. Even the mayor was involved. All manners of pretenses were used to decoy the victims aboard ships lying in the Thames or the places where they could be assaulted and forcibly conveyed on board to be disposed of to the ship's company or to the merchants. They would trick people into the ships, is what they tell all kinds of things to get them on. All right. The practice first arose in connection with the West India plantations. Barbados and other island plantations probably received a much greater number than the American colonies. So a lot of these kidnapped people ended up in Barbados and other plantations of the West Indies. We find a case belonging to Virginia as early as 1644. In 1664, the abuse had grown so bad that tumults were frequently raised in the streets of London. It was only necessary to point the finger at a woman and call her a common spirit to raise a riot against her. They were even it was happening so much in England. I mean, your child would go to the market and he would be taken away. He wouldn't come back, disappear. Your family member, anybody. So it was becoming a big thing over there. People were riot over this. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen of London and a number of merchant, planters, and shipmasters sent petitions urging the establishment of a registry office to put an end to the practice. The office was established in September of that year and was to register all covenants and issue certificates to the merchants. The penalty for not registering any person who was to be transported as a servant was £20, and the consent of friends or relatives in person at the office was necessary for the transportation of anyone under 12 years of age. A good reason had to be shown for such transportation. Even these strict regulations failed to stop the practice. And in 1670, it was necessary to report to Parliament to prevent the abuse by imposing a penalty death without benefit of clergy. So they were trying so many things to make this, stop. Trying to put laws into place and all this stuff. Trying to put fines, just so people won't stop getting kidnapped and we'll send them over here and dump them over here.
Now, why is this not being known more widely in America? Why is this being swept under the rug?
we have a gigantic industry in the United States and in the West which is determined to limit black people to a slave mentality, to tell them you've been slaves, and the only way you're ever going to get out of that is to rely on the slave mentality of the socialistic welfare democratic system, which is going to subsidize your manumission ever further. Well, as we know, no one ever gets out of his own bondage by someone else doing it for you. It's by your own work that you bring yourself out of bondage. Because certainly white slaves were the ones who freed themselves.
Because undoubtedly many of the working class whites, the descendants of working class whites in America, are therefore descendants of white slavery.
Absolutely, and especially in Appalachia, where you had the phenomenon of the so-called border southern whites, the whites who peopled West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. People like Andrew Johnson, who became the President of the United States. He was Vice President under Lincoln. Andrew Johnson had been an indentured servant. He was an apprentice tailor. He was treated brutally. He ran away. I don't consider him a white slave in the technical sense, because by that period in America's history, it had moved into, as a mass phenomenon, into something that was more a temporary bondage. However, nevertheless, you did have the fact that a reward was posted for him. For a president of the United States, as a young man, a reward was posted, a wanted poster was issued, and he had to flee the state of Tennessee. That there has been a terrible distortion of history, and really an indictment of our historians for allowing this absurdity to hold forth. That there has been one race that has been enslaved more than the others. That may be the modern sense since 1840. It is certainly not the sense of the entire corpus of world history. In fact, the opposite has held true. Whites have been enslaved to the same extent or more than blacks.
The other unwilling participants in the colonial labor force were the kidnapped. So people that were saying they were being spirited away. Astounding numbers are reported to have been snatched from the streets and countryside by gangs of kidnappers or spirits working to satisfy the colonial hunger for labor. Based at every sizable port in the British Isles, spirits combed or coerced the unwary onto ships bound for America. London's most active kidnap gang discussed their targets at a daily meeting in St. Paul's Cathedral. They were reportedly paid £2 by planners, agents for every athletic-looking young man they brought aboard. According to a contemporary who campaigned against the black slave trade, kidnappers were snatching an average of around 10,000 whites a year. Doubtless an exaggeration, but one that indicates a problem serious enough to create its own grip on the popular mind. Along with the vast numbers ejected from Britain and forced to slave in the colonies were the still greater multitudes who went of their own free will, indentured servants in the Americas in return for free passage and perhaps a promise of a plot of land. The promised land. They wanted your promised land. Between 1620 and 1775, these volunteer servants, some 300,000, accounted for those out of the three migrants from the British Isles. Continuing in the book, it says, throughout the colonial period, those who were sold into servitude, or who sold themselves as servants, formed the majority of immigrants. All these European immigrants, most of them were servants, indentured servants, kidnapped, brought over here to slave, really. But they have often had short shrift from historians. In other words, the social historian Gary B. Nash, most depictions of early America as a garden of opportunity airbrushed indentured servants out of the picture, while focusing on the minority who arrived free. All right, so they were trying to rewrite history, make it seem less harsh on white people, and make it seem like they actually weren't so much slaves or indentured servants. You know, we already know this because they didn't tell us none of this in school. Did they ever teach you it was white slaves or white indentured servants in school? They might have mentioned it, but no, they focus on so-called black Africans, right? And slavery roots, right? Kunta Kinte. A creation myth has flourished in which early American settlers are portrayed as free men and women who created a democratic and egalitarian model society more or less from scratch. All right? That's fake. That's a myth. The creation myth. That's a myth. They weren't free men. They weren't free men and women. The truth could not be more different, all right? The freedoms of modern American society evolved only gradually from enforced labor and penal servitude. Many of those instrumental in planning the earliest colonies were, like the reputedly rich man Elizabethan England, Sir Thomas Smith, ruthless and oblivious to the misery they caused. They were nonetheless often men of vision, extraordinary resilience. The tale of white slave trade unfolds through their exuberant lives no less than through those who were their victims. European slavery in early America is contained within 2 centuries and between 3 continents. From the tiny band of Englishmen who established Jamestown in 1607 to the slave ports of Africa and finally to the Captain Cook feeling his way along the shores of what was to become New South Wales in 1770. In 1607, an expedition laid the foundations for English settlement in America, and when American independence closed the mainland colonies to the dumping of convicts and undesirables, Australia provided a new penal colony. In between the stream of humanity flowed in a vast current across the Atlantic, but has since been diverted from its place in the histories of the British Empire and of the United States. They tried to hide this from us our whole lives. As soon as the new nation of America was born, it became commonplace to deny the central part played in its establishment by key sections of founding fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Those who choose to ignore the place of both the villain and the ill used in the new country's history included contemporary apologists, whose motivation was to create both social cohesion and status. In Virginia, the Old Dominion, where ideals of freedom flourished and where America's aristocracy was rooted, it was unacceptable for jailbirds to be discovered lurking in the family tree. Just 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, this is what Thomas Jefferson wrote about convicts, all right? The male factors sent to America were not sufficient in number to merit enumeration as one class out of 3 which peopled America. I do not think the whole number sent would amount to 2,000, and being principally men, eaten up with disease, they married seldom and propagated little. I did part of the whole inhabitants. So what he's trying to point out here is that Thomas Jefferson tried to write down or write off the indentured servitude. All the convicts actually came in. He's trying to say it was only 1,000. We already got at least up to 300,000. In fact, at the time of the Declaration, nearly 1,000 convicts a year were being done. Dealer intimated that in the 1700s, more than 30,000 convicts had been sold in Maryland alone. Alright? Nevertheless, right up to the present day, many Americans have difficulty reconciling themselves to the true nature of their antecedents. Alright? Many of the white Americans today, they don't want to admit, they don't want to admit or know that their ancestors possibly came in as indentured servants, are most likely convicts, undesirables, poor people that they didn't want in England, and they dumped them over here, right? They did their indentured servitude, did their time, eventually got their freedom, got a little bit of money because they had their own indenture to farm or whatever, and then they started grouping together all these light-skinned, pale-faced people, and they started creating their white neighborhood and started separating everything based on race, and they were starting to get their freedom, and the so-called aboriginals weren't, not. And this is what, and then they started writing history, right? Rewriting and erasing everything that actually happened that made them look bad, right? The truth is that in Virginia and Maryland, a significant proportion of the early settlers was composed of convicts. The fact that wealth and nobility could grow from such material is testimony not to the importance of bloodstock, but to social evolution. You see what they're saying? So you got all these convicts who eventually became the aristocrats. You understand what they're telling you here? All these convicts became aristocrats in Virginia and Maryland. Criminals. So they're saying this shows that it doesn't matter what blood you're coming from, what family, if you're coming from a poor family, what type of blood you have in you, eventually you can also be successful if you do business right? That's what they're letting you know here. It's not the importance of blood type, but social evolution. This book features some of the great names of American history with the message of white slaves, as well as black. It tracks the ruthless kingpins of the white servant trade who bought and sold their human wares, sometimes disguising convicts as regular servants, sometimes hawking servants from settlement to settlement, and it tells the story of those who sold and those who sold themselves. Some refused to be victims and fought the system by running away, by rebellion, and even by murder. Many others succumbed to disease or exploitation or to attack from Native Americans. Some thrived and laid down roots. Alright, so it keeps going. And down here it says the Oxford Dictionary defines it as slaves, persons who are legal property of another or others and bound to absolute obedience. In short, human chattel. Now listen to this. By this definition, white servants were the first slaves in America. White servants were the first slaves in America, people. Listen again. White slaves were the first slaves in America, and it is upon their labor and later that of so-called African Americans thought to hijack Aboriginals, Indians, that the nation was initially built. Today, tens of millions of white Americans are descended from such chatels. Again, today, tens of millions of white Americans are descended from such convicts, indentured servants, human slaves, white slaves. It is a shame that few in America claim these largely forgotten men and women of the early frontier as their own. They're so ashamed of it, they don't even claim it or even know. You understand? And where did all these people end up? Again, that's White Cargo, the forgotten history of Britain's white slaves in America. All right, we'll get back into this book. We just want to get a little bit, just want to show you that there's books, there's history out there, there's a research, and it's history. This is not a conspiracy. This is not trying to make people look down, trying to say, oh, it was just all white people. No, man, just trying to tell you a reality that you never knew. All right, it started with white slaves, slavery in America.
And the mid-18th century is a moment when the penny press has generated a whole set of new narratives that are emerging, very often published by anyone who could afford a printing press, and which was not insubstantial, but there were a variety of new narratives entering the popular libraries. And Peter Williamson, his story is remarkable. He was kidnapped as a young boy, sent into slavery, as he described it, as an indentured servant, a very long apprentice contract, 10 years of indentured servitude in Pennsylvania, at the end of which he was then drafted into the local militia when he fought in the French and Indian War, and was then captured by Delaware Indians and became a captive again, second captive. And he finally escapes from the Delaware Indian and then returns to Great Britain, where he then publishes his memoir called French and Indian Cruelty. And in it, he embraces some of these new ideas that are emerging about a white identity that really are more than a language of traffic, but also a language of romance and a language and an ideology of victimhood and some of the things that we've already discussed that are more familiar. At the heart of his story is the white damsel that he comes upon when he himself is a captive. And he finds her tied to a tree, and the Delaware Indians are about to kill her. And he, along with his other fellow captives, find a way to rescue her, and she's actually rescued by a British soldier, a British officer, and then there's that kind of redemption of sorts. And it's an imperial context, certainly. The other way in which I guess I would describe Williamson's whiteness is on display is here, in this image, in which he sold his book in the garb of a Delaware Indian. And so it wasn't enough just to have a really interesting story that linked different kinds of captivity in colonial America. But in fact, he would go to book fairs, small little marketplaces around his native town of Aberdeen, and would sell French and Indian cruelty, and he pretended to be a Delaware Indian. And here he is dressed as one, and he's got a tomahawk, his scalping knife, his shot bag, his bag of wampum, his powder horn, his Indian canoe. Well, that's in the image. He didn't carry that with him, and then a war dance. So he would perform being Indian. He would perform his capacity to appropriate Indian culture, playing Indian. He was not the first British subject to do this. This kind of love affair with the exotic subject in the empire was not new. What is unique is that he's the first traffic subject to do that, and to use that as a way of gaining an audience. If you've read the work of David Rodiger, whose work remains foundational to the field and U.S. labor history, it is black-based minstrelsy. It is the institution in which white workers would become white and become white supremacists in the early national period. You have here, in effect, an earlier prototype for that, which is playing Indian, a trafficked servant doing this work. Indeed, the formation of working classes was closely bound up with a mixture of radical anti-slavery sentiment on the one hand and newly embraced white victimhood. That mixture of whiteness and radical anti-slavery did not preclude the formation of working class consciousness, but rather comprised the cultural and intellectual fabric from which it emerged. White slavery, so-called, was at the formative moment. It was the discourse in which classes emerged in Great Britain and the United States. That trope did not preclude working class support for black abolitionism, but frequently, in fact, advanced a broader abolition of all slaveries, black as well as white.
Continuing in the book, White Servitude in the Colony of Virginia, a study of the system of indentured labor in the American colonies. It says here in chapter 2 still, page 40 says the servants of Virginia were usually English, Scotch, or Irish, but there were also a few Dutch, French, Portuguese, and Polish. They were usually transported persons, but residents in the colony also sold themselves into servitude for various reasons. All right, colonists sold themselves into servitude. Well, why didn't they just go get Africans if it was so easy? The demand for servants before the rise of slavery was always very great in the American colonies and was further enhanced by that of the island plantations. It was the impossibility of supplying this by the regular means that furnished the justification professed in the English penal statutes and gave encouragement to the illicit practice of spiriting, kidnapping. In the early years before these means were resorted to, dealing in servants had become a very profitable business. The London merchants were not slow to see the advantage of such a trade. A servant might be transported at a cost of from 6 to 8 pounds and sold for 40 pounds or 60 pounds, and a systematic speculation in servants was begun both in England and in Virginia. Regular agencies were established, and servants might be had by anyone who wished to import them at a day's warning. Others were consigned to merchants of Virginia or sent with shiploads of goods on a venture. The demand continued unabated until near the last quarter of the 17th century. The numbers were so considerable in 1651 that the commissioner of the Commonwealth, who were sent to demand the submission of Virginia, were authorized, in case of resistance, to levy the servants for reducing the colony. From this time to the beginning of the decline of the system, the yearly importations were very large. The number imported from 1664 to 1671 averaged 1,500 a year.
So one of the things I also discovered in the research is that white slavery is the political content of whiteness was remarkably divided. And that there was kind of fight over its political meaning.
John Duarte only looks out for millionaires like himself. Duarte faced a lawsuit for withholding pay from his workers. He even voted to cut access to Social Security and to raise costs for health care. We can't afford John Duarte.
For a limited time, Domino's Rewards members can try new 5-cheese mac and cheese for just 30 points.
It's important for recognizing a kind of fault line in contemporary white supremacy. This was not simply an assertion or a naturalized understanding that all white people share something. It had a particular political target in mind, the way it was being used by traffic subjects. That said, the ways in which whiteness became legitimated as a broader cross-class identity at this moment in time, a political project that was uncertain, fighting abolitionism, as well as supporting it, critiquing imperial policy, as well as supporting other ones.
All right, so this guy's been breaking down, the white slavery existed and how it was so, they were trying to separate it and how it was like a idea before white supremacy, because they were trying to separate, well, we're not like the black indentured servants of the Indian or Aboriginal indentured servants, we're white, right? But they wanted that before. They didn't call themselves that, but they would call themselves Christian before that. But now there's a white supremacy beginning to develop, is what he's seeing, all right? Again, how did you become in the ghettos and how did they become in the suburbs and get all these high positions, good jobs, and go to good colleges and stuff?
Helps understand how we get to the present. And I'm going to shift one more time to the present. Precisely because white victimhood remained at heart a class discourse that critiqued the lead assumptions about value and humanity, white slavery also kept the door open as an idea to future working class white supremacists like the Underman or David Duke,
Walter Plecker.
David, former Klansman leader, who would write in his book, My Awakening, that white slavery was in fact the historical issue, the footing for his sense of racial injustice.
You hear that? All right, so real quick, I'm in the Washington Post just so you can get a clear perspective. We're talking about it was white servants, white slaves, all right? This is the Washington Post. And it says here, the photographer who helped end child labor in America, right there. It's white children picking cotton. I'd like to show you only so-called black folks picking America, right there. It's white children picking cotton. I'd like to pick. This is the Washington Post. And it says here, the photographer who helped end child labor in America, right there. It's white children picking cotton. I'd like to show you only so-called black folks picking cotton because they want to have that image implanted into you that you came from slaves, but it was started with that white indentured servants. All right, we got rarehistoricalphotos.com, child labor in America. Look at this, 1908. This is a 7-year-old newsie. Picking cotton because they want to have that image implanted into you that you came from slaves, but it was started with that white indentured servants. All right. We got rarehistoricalphotos.com, child labor in America. Look at this, 1908. This is a 7-year-old newsie, iMobile. We got a spinner in a Globe cotton mill in Augusta, Georgia, in 1909. It says an overseer admitted she was regular. That's the mother people here. A few Western Union messengers in Hartford, Connecticut. All indentured serving apprentices, as they would call them. Remember, they were stealing children. They were kidnapping children from England. Since the 1600s. Alright, now look at this one. It says, let me just zoom in, alright? So I'm zoomed in. See that? White child, right? White girl. It says, Callie Campbell, 11 years old, picks 75 to 125 pounds of cotton a day and totes 50 pounds of it when sacks get full. No, I don't like it very much. Photographed in Pottawatomie County, Oklahoma. October 16, 1916. Alright, see that? Picking cotton. Wasn't just black folks. Continuing the book, White Servitude in Colonial America, an Economic Analysis. We're in chapter 10. And it says, Indentured Labor in the Americas, the Experience of 3 Centuries. Servitude in Colonial British America. We're on page 1971. The indenture system resulted from the efforts of early British colonizers of America to transplant the English system of service and husbandry to the New World. Under the English system, boys and girls left home in their early teens to work by the year, usually as farm servants. During this period, they lived in the households of their employers, typically remaining in the status of life cycle servants until they married. A significant alteration of the English institution was required to enable many young Englishmen and women to perform their life cycle service in British America. For the cost of the transatlantic voyage was greater than most could pay out of their savings, and credit for the passage fare was typically unavailable from existing sources in England. The innovation of the colonial system of indentured servitude provided the necessary credit to those who wished to emigrate to British America. The former took with the labor of the servants leased for specific periods to the masters who purchased their contracts, meant that the system also supplied colonial planters with a bound labor force. All right, it was a contract. It wasn't slavery. All right, so yeah, a lot of good content in this book. I'm not going to go into the whole book. Just want to read some things. I want you to know that this is an actual history, right? White servitude, white indentured servants. This was real. Preceded, so-called black slavery. All right, that's part 1. We read a little bit. Part 2, you see, has a lot of different information. The age and sex distributions of the indentured servants. We're talking about the white people right here and Europeans. Part 3, patterns of servant migration from England to America. Colonial destination of the servants. All right, the market for indentured servants. All right, indentured servitude in the market evaluation based on what they did and their skills. All right, the role of indentured servant in the colonial labor market. White servitude in the colonial labor market. All right, this is real. And now we just wanted to go back to the other book. We're back in the book, They Were White and They Were Slaves by Michael A. Hoffman. So here, David Brian Davis, writing in the New York Review of Books, October 11th, 1990, page 37 states, As late as the 14th and 15th centuries, continuing shipment of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave market on the northern Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain and Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands from Barbados to Virginia. Colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin or people of color they're talking about, aborigines, anybody who was dark-skinned. I thought I L. Rukamis, in The Source of Racial Thought in Colonial America, states that the slave trade worked in both directions, with white merchandise as well as black. Journal of Negro History, number 52, pages 251 and 273. In 1659, the English Parliament debated the practice of selling British whites into slavery in the New World. In the debate, the whites were referred to not as indentured servants, but as slaves, whose enslavement threatened the liberties of all Englishmen. Thomas Burn, Parliamentary Diary, 1656-59, volume 4, pages 253 and 274. Foster R. Duels, A Labor in America, quotes an early document describing white children in colonial servitude as crying and mourning for redemption from their slavery. Dr. Henry McTeague, Beckles of the University of All England, writes, regarding white slave labor, indentured contracts were alienable, the ownership of which could easily be transferred like that of any other commodity. As white slaves, ownership changed without their participation in the dialogue concerning transfer. Beckles refers to indentured servitude as white proto-slavery. The Americas, volume 41, number 2, page 21. In the calendar of state papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies of 1701, we read of a protest over the encouragement to the spirited way of Englishmen without their consent in selling them for slaves, which had been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping, or spirited.
Oh yeah, let's go with that maybe there are some people beans. Yeah. Read this stuff. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He said, you know naturally come hot, hot, there, No, no, no. It's been long. You know, naturally, top. Down the knee, you take the song to know that la. Boy, go boy. Okay. Fades.
A comida está processando. Por favor, aguarde.
Không nghĩ được sao. Trong tầm ai dạ mình nghĩ cái Christmas của mình là what can we not accomplish? Ching. Oh, this one. Okay, hold up. Scheiße. Bist du blöde? Menschen? What are you doing? What would you be doing? Second thing. Looking on the wall. Sticky, icky. Ooh, oi. This has gotta be a little bit. 66 seconds. Ooh, you know that. Okay, oh, that one either? Can you go to the store? Oh yeah. Reward associated with it? Let me get through that. Just a hint. Oh, Dankeschön. Vielen Dank. And shit like that. Let's see. Okay. What are you talking about, guys? You can watch. Let me see. Let me put you to the test. Ciao, cheers. Don't get this up. Man, I thought the OG. I'm so happy to be eating. Hey, man. Ching, ching, got him. Ching, ching, got him. Just trying to kill him. One apart. What's the hot stuff? Wait. Power, nigga? Oh. Shit, they didn't tell me they were gangsters. They couldn't have told me they were gangsters. They couldn't have said, nigga, you gangster. They couldn't. It's impossibilities that are associated with them telling me, nigga, you gangster. It's just, oh my gosh, it's staggering. It outweighs the possibility of saying, nigga, you not gangster. it's staggering, mind-boggling the numbers affiliated with my gangsterness. Time in. That's side steps on top. We see. Okay. That's why I feel good already. I will prefer to that. Bother me. Make me too loud. Oh my gosh. You're such a little bitch. We out? We out? Yeah. Go. Go and talk with him. Go and chat. Soon. Ah, wait. I need to get some more. If possible. In boost. Let's see what you're talking about. That's not too nice. See. What's up, dog? You from West? I don't believe you. Oh, I forgot to even take those. Oh my gosh. What am I thinking? Lost in the rainforest. Smoking shit. Going to talk? Texas. I'm very appreciative. You gave me time to let me change my weapon set and everything. top let's that's it. He fell down just like that. Or let's say it fell down just like that. My bad, nigga, but you owe me rent. That's just because I feel like nigga, what you got on my 40. Let me say something. And why? Now we get out. Oh my god. Đấy á, vài củ tải. Cheers. Wiedersehen. That bird is on the line. And it's not me. Ship shum. Ship shuminye. Sha. It's beanie. Push up a bunch. Speed, skinny, gas. Watch your step, buddy. Do not fall for that wall. Just don't do it. Alright? Stick. Means? Hold? No. Relax. Hold. You're playing. Step in the forward, they check in the body back, motherfucker, this ain't no lot like egg, when I'm in the big and then up and out, and then the horse is not the head, the face, the boy bad, when I did a bit of action, bring it, rap and sing it, bust up with a dog, whatever y'all wanna do, I'm with it. They don't know another fight, and they don't want another mother that can give a mother up with another dozen. Again, then they get a buzz and give some money to the face that nigga you dial up to get rowdy, rolling round up, so medicine now what? They get back to the underground to get down, wicked this style on, huh? Step in the pod, they get the body back, motherfucker, this ain't all the gag, but I'm gonna pick it in up and I said, a little bit of hot, start your head, let's fight the boys back, and then a bit of action, bring it, rap and sing it, bust a bit of a dog, whatever you're gonna do, I'm with it, bring it, they no. Just one word changed from what you believe it to be. and it all goes to charge. ¿Qué tal? ¿Qué haces, loco? ¿Qué haciendas? This shit. Well, look more side, nigga. Play. Oh, the army. The west side. Cleveland. That fight was they look like they push. Why? This is the light. Shoot. Das ist nächste Mal. Jack of the excellent sniper. Stick it up with fuck that shit. That's really what it is. I mean, you can't be like that. I think I ain't about shit. Okay. No, I can't let you walk around. No, I can't even let you do it. I can't even allow that shit on me. Up on the west side of Cleveland, nigga. Other niggas west side. Cleveland? We're out of Cleveland, nigga. You ain't even know. Step in the party, dragging that body back. Motherfucker, this ain't no like that. Step in the party, dragging the body back. Motherfucker, this ain't no like that. And then pick it up and ask that. And watch that. Get it. That's right. But we're getting right to say, we're going to be going. And then that's right. Then it was stop. You see how coming. Still one shoots with the cross. Be outside. Yeah. Kick me out. And you need to shit up this shit. Outside. That's good. That's got me something. That's just good. Hey, Jim. Just okay, you mind? Don't say. This is accurate. It's for science. Because I'm the most badass motherfucker on the face of the earth, nigga. I thought I told you, motherfucker. Get that pesan. Piensas. Bien solo. Arcade ops. Like, I've gotten the awards from all of those different ops, and there's no point in returning other than if I desire to attempt to have fun. LOL. And shit. But the niggas in the bed didn't follow with the DPD7 because the automatic said they get them. A nigga let away when I get up and put these niggas in their ass. Like a nipple to the penicillin. Murder. Nigga wanna play a fidget with it. We got a covenant to fidget with it. The bullets come with it. I heard niggas be in the sauce and everything gush when we walk. I let them talk, but that's I let the niggas talk. They been no shit. Nigga better show some affirmative action. Oh, what you doing? Just hanging out with the fellas. Sources suggest that you didn't pay your taxes. Appreciate that. Smiles. Try it. Chew it. Take it. Silence. I just freaking slow. Bitch. Alright. Forgot about it, huh? You think you about that lifestyle? Is that what you think? I really want to give her a game. Wait, Chevrolet. This is what you gonna do. Normal. Se fue. Tea vendor. Oh my gosh. Are you guys selling any soup? Hey, you want drinks and ads, and so when nigga get religious with it. Sucker. Playing away. Just breathing. Oh, well that shit. Let's see if it does something miraculously. Oh, I think, oh, really? Alright. I can find them all and see the ink. Just in case, you know, just for the case. Wow. The motherfucker in the club halls was up on the floor now. Niggas was rooting, tooting, shooting, so keep it around about the club halls. And never left but thugs. We broke his off and shoot this motherfucker. Niggas was putting it up on the fucking niggas was putting it up on us like that was waiting for this shit to happen. What's happening for me to come? It's hot for my thugs. No. I can't believe this shit. I can't believe this shit. They got up in the middle of the river. They're gonna jump it down the river. It's gonna come and take it. It's gonna take this monkey's game. So we stop the door, but not so many. That was how you could follow. Just making sure. Got the stock in concrete. Okay. I'm so ready. Are you ready? Oh, okay, sure.